Imagine a world turned upside down in a single bloody moment. Think of the most powerful person you know, someone everyone looks up to, suddenly struck down by the very people he trusted. That's what happened in Rome over 2,000 years ago. It wasn't just a killing. It was a ritual, a bloodbath in the heart of the city made of marble. The man who thought he was a god, Julius Caesar, bled out at the feet of a statue of his biggest enemy, Pompey the Great. It's a harsh joke, isn't it? His killers, senators who had just eaten dinner with him the night before, held up their bloody daggers. They didn't run away, they shouted. They called themselves the Liberators. They truly believed that on that day, March 15th, 44 BC, they had saved the Republic. They thought they had cut off the head of the snake of tyranny. In their pride, they expected the people of Rome to cheer them in the streets to thank them for giving back freedom. But the people didn't cheer. The silence in the forum was their first death sentence. A heavy, thick silence full of fear. Not fear of the dead ruler, but fear of them, the men who had let chaos loose. Why did the people they claimed to have saved meet them with dread instead of flowers? Because the average Roman didn't live in fancy villas like the senators. They lived in the tough, real world. And Caesar, the tyrant, had given them stability, victories, and food. The Liberators, on the other hand, only offered them an unclear idea of freedom and a lot of blood. The mastermind behind the plot, Gaius Cassius Longinus, was a man full of personal hate. The face, the symbol of it all, was Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's adopted son, the man whose betrayal gave Caesar the fatal wound. They say Caesar's last words when he saw Brutus's face weren't angry but full of sad surprise. "You too, my son?" They thought they had won. They marched to the capital, dug in, waiting for the city to see them as the new fathers of the country. They underestimated one man, a man who hadn't pulled a dagger but whose words would be sharper than any steel, the consul Mark Antony. And even worse, they underestimated a ghost, a name. Hundreds of miles away in Apollonia, an 18-year-old boy, sickly and unknown, received a letter. It told him that his great-uncle, Julius Caesar, had been murdered. But that wasn't the news that would change the world. The real shock was in the will. Caesar had adopted him as his son and main heir. That boy, ignored by everyone, would become the living embodiment of revenge. He didn't just inherit Caesar's money, he inherited his name. And with that name, a blood oath. His name was Gaius Octavius. His arrival in Rome would mark the beginning of the end for every single one of the 60 men who plunged their steel into his adopted father's body. They didn't know it yet, but they hadn't killed a man. They had unleashed two monsters, civil war and Octavius. The hunt was about to begin, and it wouldn't stop until the last of the Liberators paid their debt with blood. For a moment, it seemed like blood wouldn't call for more blood. In a desperate move to avoid civil war, the Senate granted forgiveness to the killers. A shaky, tense pardon. Brutus and Cassius came down from the Capitol, believing they had weathered the storm. They even had dinner with Mark Antony in a truce as fake as the smiles on their faces. They controlled the Senate, they had their daggers, they thought they had the power. Their mistake was allowing Caesar a state funeral. Brutus was the first to speak. His speech was a work of calm logic, cold, reasoned, philosophical. He talked about goodness, duty, love for the Republic. He explained that he didn't kill Caesar out of hate, but out of love for Rome. It's not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. The crowd, confused, nodded. They seemed to accept that the terrible act was necessary. The Liberators breathed a sigh of relief. But then Mark Antony stepped up to the speaker's platform. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse. His voice was a whisper of pain that still reached every corner of the forum. "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," he began. "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him." He said Brutus was an honorable man, that they all were. He repeated the phrase again and again. Honorable men, and with each repetition the word honorable rotted, becoming poison, a sarcasm sharp as a knife. Then he bent down and lifted the toga covering Caesar's body. The purple cloth, stiff with dried blood, showed the 23 tears. "Look, through this hole Cassius's dagger entered. See what a gash the envious Casca made, and through this other the beloved Brutus stabbed." He turned a political killing into a personal slaughter. He made the crowd see not a tyrant but a betrayed man. And then came the knockout blow. He pulled out a scroll of papyrus, Julius Caesar's will. The crowd gasped when Antony read that Caesar left his private gardens to the people of Rome to be public parks forever. And then the final touch. Caesar left every Roman citizen, every man in that plaza, a sum of 75 drachmas. All hell broke loose. Brutus's speech, so logical, vanished before pure emotion. The people's love for their murdered benefactor exploded in an uncontrollable wave of violence. They tore down benches and tables from the forum to build a makeshift funeral pyre for their hero right there. Then, with torches lit from that sacred fire, the mob became a pack of wolves. They no longer looked for liberators, they looked for killers. Their first victim was an unlucky poet named Gaius Helvius Cinna. They confused him with one of the conspirators, Lucius Cornelius Cinna. His pleas didn't matter. It didn't matter that he shouted he was just a poet. They tore him limb from limb in the middle of the street. It was the first payment of the blood debt. Brutus, Cassius, and the others saw the flames from their homes. They saw the people they claimed to have freed marching towards them with torches and knives. Their dream of a republic had turned into a nightmare. They had to flee Rome like thieves in the night. They were no longer senators, they were fugitives. And while they ran for their lives to the east, the real danger, the young Octavius, landed in southern Italy. He didn't bring an army, he brought something much more powerful, Caesar's name and a checkbook that would soon seem to have no end. And he was about to use both to buy the loyalty of Rome's deadliest weapon, his father's legions. While Rome burned and the killers fled, Octavius played his own game, a chess match on a board of razor blades. When he arrived in Rome, he presented himself to Mark Antony, the new boss of the city. Antony saw him for what he was, a pale, inexperienced boy, a simple annoyance. He refused to give him Caesar's fortune, using the money to strengthen his own power. It was a miscalculation that would cost him the world. They underestimated his name. Octavius began to sign as Caesar Octavian, a stroke of genius for the people and the legions. He was Caesar, and when Antony denied him the money, Octavius did the unthinkable. He sold his own properties and those inherited from his family to pay the people the 75 drachmas Caesar's will promised. He kept his father's word. Overnight, the boy became the favorite of the common people, and more importantly, of Caesar's legion veterans. Men hardened by 1,000 battles who had adored the general. They saw in that young man the rebirth of their leader. Octavius didn't ask for their loyalty. He bought it with money, promises, and above all with the power of an immortal man. He stole the legions from Antony right under his nose. The tension exploded. The two avengers of Caesar declared war on each other. But as they fought in northern Italy, alarming news reached them from the east. Brutus and Cassius weren't wasting time. They had plundered the eastern provinces, gathering a gigantic war treasury. They had recruited and trained 19 legions, a formidable army funded by extortion and ready to march on Italy. Antony and Octavius realized a terrifying truth. They hated Caesar's killers more than they hated each other. They met on a small island in a river near Bologna. Antony, Octavius, and a third man, Lepidus, Caesar's general. There among the mud and fog, these three men formed the second triumvirate. It wasn't an alliance, it was a pact of predators. They divided the world as if it were loot, and then, to fund their war and eliminate their enemies at home, they unleashed terror. The proscriptions were not just a simple list of enemies, they were a public death sentence. Hundreds of senators and thousands of wealthy citizens were declared enemies of the state. Their names, written on plaster tablets, were nailed in the forum. Anyone could kill them. Not only was it allowed, there was a reward. The killer received a part of the dead man's property. The rest went to the triumvirate. Rome sank into a bloody paranoia. Slaves murdered their masters to gain their freedom. Sons betrayed fathers for inheritance. No one was safe. And on that list, Antony demanded one name above all, Marcus Tullius Cicero, Rome's greatest speaker. Cicero was not one of the killers, but his speeches against Antony had sealed his fate. Octavius, who owed Cicero his political rise, agreed. He sacrificed him without batting an eye. Antony's assassins caught him near his villa. Cicero ordered his servants not to resist and offered his neck. They cut off his head and hands, the same hands that had written the speeches that so offended Antony. They brought them to Rome and in an act of extreme cruelty nailed them to the speaker's platform, the rostrum from which Cicero had spoken so many times. The revenge was complete. With Rome cleansed and its coffers filled with the blood of its enemies, the triumvirate turned its gaze to the east. The purge was over. Now the war began. Brutus and Cassius were not hiding. They had gathered in Greece with their 19 legions. The final showdown that would decide the fate of the Republic was unavoidable. The end of the Roman world had gathered on a plain in Greece called Philippi. It wasn't one army against another. It was one era against the next. On one side, Octavius and Antony, with Caesar's name as their banner and revenge as their fuel. On the other, Brutus and Cassius, with the dying idea of the Republic and the memory of a bloody dagger. More than 200,000 men. The largest concentration of Roman military power history had ever seen, about to wipe each other out. The Liberators' plan was clever. It was based on the cold logic of Cassius, an experienced general. His army was better supplied and controlled the sea. His strategy: wait, avoid a pitched battle, let hunger and disease wear down the triumvir's legions. But Brutus was not a strategist. He was a philosopher turned general. He was tormented. It was said that in his camp the omens were terrible. 2 eagles that followed his legions were replaced by ravens and vultures the day they arrived at Philippi. And legend has it that nights before the battle, a ghostly and terrible apparition appeared to him in his tent. "Who are you?" Brutus asked. The shadow replied, "I am your evil spirit, Brutus. We will meet at Philippi." Was it Caesar's ghost or the ghost of his own guilt? Pressed by his impatient officers and haunted by his demons, Brutus imposed his will. They would force the battle. Cassius, against his better judgment, gave in. The first battle of Philippi was a chaos of blood and dust. On the right flank, Brutus's legions, with unstoppable fury, overran Octavius's forces, broke their lines, massacred their men, and looted their camp. Octavius, ill, barely escaped with his life. From his perspective, it was a crushing victory. The Republic seemed to be reborn in a single, glorious assault. But at the same time, on the other flank, the story was completely different. Mark Antony's veteran troops, more disciplined, shattered Cassius's legions. Antony's attack was brutal, relentless. Cassius's camp was taken, his men massacred or put to flight. 2 simultaneous battles with 2 opposite results, and in the middle, the fog of war. Cassius had retreated to a hill to observe the battlefield. He saw in the distance that Brutus's camp was taken, but he couldn't know that it was Brutus's own men celebrating and looting. Then he saw a detachment of cavalry galloping towards him. They were Brutus's men coming to announce his victory, but in the dust and distance, Cassius believed they were enemy cavalry. He believed Brutus had been defeated. He believed all was lost. The fog of war and a cloud of dust condemned the man who had started everything. "Take it," he told his freedman, handing him a dagger. "Free me from life." Pindarus obeyed. Cassius covered his face with his cloak and received the blow. He died at the hands of his own slave, using, according to legend, the same dagger with which he had stabbed Julius Caesar in the Senate. The final irony for a practical man, defeated not by the enemy but by a tragic illusion. Shortly after, Brutus's messengers arrived at the hill, shouting the news of his victory. They found only the body of their commander. When Brutus arrived and saw the body of his friend and brother-in-law, his spirit broke. He called him in tears, the last of the Romans. Cassius, the brain of the conspiracy, was dead, but Brutus, the soul of the movement, still lived. He commanded an army that was still formidable. For 3 weeks, the 2 sides watched each other, the tension growing with each sunrise. Brutus knew that time was running out. His men were demoralized. Victory had turned to ashes in his mouth. Pressured by his own troops and tormented by Caesar's ghost, he made the decision that would seal his fate. He ordered a second and final attack. 3 weeks, 21 sunrises during which the remnants of the Republic's greatest army and the embodiment of Caesar's revenge watched each other across a blood-soaked valley. In Brutus's camp, morale had collapsed. Cassius's ghost and his useless death weighed on everyone. His legionaries, many of them mercenaries, began to desert. His officers pressured him, demanding one last battle before the entire army dissolved. Brutus, the philosopher, the idealist, was no longer in control. He was trapped by the current of events he himself had unleashed. The second battle of Philippi did not have the chaotic uncertainty of the first. It was a massacre. Brutus's legions charged with desperation, not conviction. They faced Antony and Octavius's veteran troops, hardened men, better commanded, and fighting for victory, not to avoid defeat. The Republican lines bent, then broke. The retreat turned into an uncontrolled flight. The dream of the Republic did not die with a shout of defiance, but with the sound of thousands of men running for their lives. Brutus managed to escape the battlefield with a handful of his most loyal officers. They hid in the nearby hills, listening to the victory shouts of their enemies and the sound of Antony's cavalry combing the area, searching for him. The man who had ruled Rome for an instant was now a cornered fugitive in the darkness of a Greek forest. There on the cold night, Brutus knew that everything was over. He looked at his friends and spoke words that revealed the brokenness of his soul. He lamented that the virtue for which he had sacrificed everything might be nothing more than an empty word, and that he had been a slave to fortune. The idealist crashed against the wall of reality. He had killed his friend and mentor for an idea, and that idea had just died before his eyes. He would not allow himself to be captured. The humiliation of being dragged through the streets of Rome in Octavius's triumph was a fate worse than death. He asked one of his officers, Clitus, to kill him. Clitus refused, crying. He asked another, Dardanus, who also refused. Finally, he approached his friend Strato. He asked him to hold his sword with the point towards him. Strato, with tears in his eyes, obeyed. Brutus used his last strength to run and impale himself on the blade. He died instantly. The soul of the conspiracy had been extinguished. Shortly after, Antony's men found his body. Mark Antony, in a gesture of unexpected nobility, took off his very expensive purple general's cloak and covered the body of his enemy. He would later say that Brutus was the noblest of all Romans, the only one of the conspirators who acted for an ideal, not out of envy. Octavius did not share that respect. When the news was brought to him, his reaction was chilling. He ordered Brutus's head to be cut off and sent to Rome to be thrown at the feet of Julius Caesar's statue. Octavius's revenge knew no nobility, only total annihilation. The contrast between the two victors at that moment sowed the seeds of the war that would come between them. With Brutus and Cassius dead, the heads of the conspiracy had been cut off. To the world, the civil war was over, but Octavius didn't think so. For him, the revenge was not complete until every one of the 60 men who wielded a dagger that day was dead. The Great War was over. Now began the silent hunt, a purge that would spread to every corner of the Mediterranean. For the remaining killers, hell was just beginning. After the Battle of Philippi, the power of the Roman world lay in the hands of 3 men, and one of them, Octavius, had an obsession. The list of the 60 men who had participated in his father's murder. Brutus and Cassius were only the first 2 important names to be crossed off. Dozens remained, and now the triumvirs had armies, fleets, spies, and an almost limitless treasury to find them. There was no corner in the Mediterranean where they could hide. The amnesty had been a sham. Proscription was now the law. Gaius Trebonius, the man who cunningly held Mark Antony outside the Senate while the others stabbed Caesar, believed he was safe as governor of Asia. But a general loyal to Antony captured him, tortured him for days seeking information, and then beheaded him. His head was used as a ball by soldiers in the streets of Smyrna. He was one of the first to die, a brutal warning of the kind of mercy they could expect. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, not to be confused with Marcus Brutus, was one of Caesar's closest friends, one of his most brilliant generals. Caesar had named him in his will as a secondary heir if Octavius did not accept. It was he who, on the morning of the Ides, convinced a doubtful Caesar to go to the Senate. An intimate and devastating betrayal. After Philippi, his legions in Gaul abandoned him. Suddenly, the powerful general was a man alone. He tried to cross the Alps disguised as a Gallic chieftain. He sought refuge with a local chieftain he had once called a friend, but loyalty has a price, and Decimus Brutus's head was worth a fortune. The Gallic chieftain did not hesitate. He murdered him in his own home and sent the head as a gift to Mark Antony. The friend who convinced Caesar to walk to his death was betrayed by a friend for the promise of gold. One by one they fell. Lucius Cassius, brother of the main conspirator, was murdered by order of Octavius after the battle. Publius Casca, the first man to plunge his dagger into Caesar, fled Philippi like a ghost. Legend says he wandered the world, tormented by guilt until he committed suicide in an unknown place. Or perhaps the sea claimed him in a storm. His death is a mystery. His body was never found, as if the earth itself refused to give him burial. The hunt lasted more than a decade, demonstrating Octavius's unforgiving memory. The last of the main assassins to die was Cassius Parmensis, a poet and writer who had put his pen at the service of the Republic. After Philippi, his life was an odyssey of escapes. He joined the pirate Sextus Pompey in Sicily. When Pompey was defeated, he committed the most ironic act of all. He joined Mark Antony, Caesar's murderer and Caesar's avenger, united against Caesar's son. But he chose the losing side one last time. After Antony's final defeat at the Battle of Actium, more than 14 years after the assassination, Octavius's men finally found him in Athens. He was dragged out and executed without ceremony. With his death, Octavius's list was finally almost complete. One by one they fell in battles, in dark alleys, by their own hand or by that of a traitor. None of Caesar's assassins died of old age. Most died violently, many with the same daggers they had used on the Ides of March, fulfilling a kind of poetic and terrible justice. But while revenge was being carried out, something else was happening. With each Republican senator who died, with each opponent silenced, the power of a single man grew until it became absolute. The assassins had stabbed Caesar to kill the idea of a king. In the void they left, they had cultivated the birth of something much more powerful and lasting, an emperor. The final, most crushing irony of their sacrifice had not yet been fully revealed. When the last of the assassins was hunted down and executed, a strange silence fell over the Roman world. For the first time in almost 20 years, there was no active civil war. The purge was over, but the peace Octavius had brought was the peace of a graveyard. An entire generation of the Roman aristocracy, the men who had led the Senate and commanded the legions for centuries, was dead, murdered in the proscriptions, fallen at Philippi, or purged in subsequent wars. The triumvirs' pact, forged in the blood of their enemies, could not last. With the world at their feet, the last 2 predators, Mark Antony and Octavius, turned against each other. It was a war of propaganda before it was a war of swords. Octavius from Rome painted Antony as a traitor, a Roman general enslaved by a foreign queen who wanted to rule Rome from Egypt. Antony from Alexandria saw Octavius as a tyrannical usurper, a greedy boy clinging to power. The final clash came at sea in the Battle of Actium. It was the last convulsion of the dying republic. Octavius's victory was total. Mark Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt, where, cornered and with no escape, they took their own lives. The general fell on his sword. The queen, according to legend, allowed herself to be bitten by an asp. With their deaths, the last challenge to Octavius's power vanished. Now he was alone, completely alone at the top. His father's assassins dead. The old guard of the Senate dead. His rivals, Lepidus exiled and Antony dead. He had avenged Caesar in a way that even Julius Caesar himself could not have imagined. He had absolute and undisputed power over an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. And this is where the final and most crushing irony of the story is revealed. The Liberators had stabbed Caesar because they feared he would be crowned king. They feared that a single man would destroy 500 years of republican tradition. Their act, designed to save the republic, was the catalyst that destroyed it completely. The wars they unleashed annihilated the political class that supported it, leaving a power vacuum that only one man could fill. Octavius had learned his father's lesson. He did not declare himself dictator for life. He did not wear a crown. He was much smarter. In 27 BC, he entered the Senate and in an act of political genius renounced all his extraordinary powers and declared the Republic restored. It was a brilliant farce. He maintained the appearances of the Republic, the consuls, the senators, the assemblies, but gradually and legally concentrated all real powers in his person, control of the army, of finances, of the richest provinces. The Senate, grateful for the peace, granted him a new name, Augustus, the Venerable. He became the first emperor of Rome. He ruled with more absolute power than Caesar ever dreamed of and did so for more than 40 years. He died of old age in his bed, deified as a god. Brutus, Cassius, and the others had killed a man to stop a king. The result of their sacrifice was not freedom, but the creation of an emperor and the birth of the Roman Empire. In the end, they failed to save the Republic. They only ensured that all who believed in it died, clearing the way for the new order. Their struggle for freedom was the stepping stone on which Augustus built his throne. The 23 stabs on the Senate floor did not prevent tyranny. They only chose the tyrant.